Well, a very pleasant hello to you as we talk about a fairly unpleasant thing, and that is the topic of imperialism and how it has affected the history of the world. I guess to first explain imperialism, we must understand that we call the same things by different names. In the 1600s, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, we called imperialism colonialism. In the 1800s and the first half of the 1900s, we called imperialism imperialism. Imagine that. And now we call the same thing globalization. I guess the best way to describe this is that there was a theory that was put forth by economic leaders of France and of England, and Spain was a world power at the time. And they bought into a theory that gold and silver were sources of wealth. Gold and silver were finite. In other words, they weren't limitless. And therefore, whoever controlled more gold and silver controlled more power. So what European countries in the age of discovery, so again, we're talking about 300, 400 years ago. I was just a child at the time. What Europeans believed was that they needed then to get gold and silver in order to retain power, in order to retain vitality, frankly, and that if they didn't control gold and silver, then they did not control power, they did not have power, and that meant power was in someone else's hands. And I realize that when we talk about power in historical contexts, it often feels like a couple of 2-year-olds tugging away on a Cool Whip container lid, each one yelling, "It's mine, it's mine." I guess to some degree that actually isn't an unfair statement, but I think I would put it more in a different light to understand. And the light that I would put it in to understand better is, would any of us as individuals happily turn power over to someone else over our lives? I don't think I would. Because as long as I have autonomy or power over my life, I get to write the script. I have power to write the ending. I have power to influence the direction of my life's story. I guess kings and queens, subsequently presidents and popes and emperors and other government officials, feel much the same way. They do not want to relinquish power to other countries in much the same way we would not want to relinquish power to somebody else. Then we lose the ability to write the story. I guess we can understand it at that level. Additionally, if you subscribe to the first chapter of the book of Genesis in the Bible, and I happen to, God announces that he has given man his crowning achievement, power. But what did he give man power over? Well, the fish of the sea, the fowls of the air, the beasts of the field, and every creeping thing that creepeth over the earth. But notice the one thing that God did not give man power over, and that was, yes, other men. The other thing you might notice in that is that we do have power over ourselves, control over ourselves. I would argue to you that in history is composed largely of men attempting to gain power over the one thing they weren't given power over, each other. And I would also argue that history is full of examples of men not using the one power they were given over themselves. Well, anyway, so Europeans wanting power in the 1500s, 1600s, for the reasons I've mentioned, I think, and probably many more than that, then decided they needed to get gold and silver. You know, the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. And so how do you get gold? Well, in your land, perhaps you have an unlimited resource of gold and silver. Gold mines, silver mines. That's one way. If you don't have it that way, you can trade for it. You have something that someone who has gold and silver wants and is willing to part with some of their gold and silver in order to obtain that. The third way that you can get gold and silver, I suppose, is go in and take over somebody who has gold and silver or who has the materials you want that you can then trade for gold and silver. And you'll see in the 1500s, in the 1600s, in the 1700s, Europeans practiced a philosophy called colonialism that allowed them to get gold and silver through any one of and all of those ways. Taking over lands that had gold and silver, Mexico, Central America, South America. Taking over lands that had natural resources that they could convert into gold and silver, or raw materials that they could convert into gold and silver. America with tobacco, Canada with beaver furs, the Caribbean with tobacco and sugar plantations. All of those things and many others could be converted then into gold and silver. The beautiful thing about coffee or tea or tobacco, chocolate for you chocoholics, is that you create a permanent need. You create kind of a, almost, if you will, an addiction for those things. And so as long as you can keep that addiction going, you keep a flow of gold and silver coming into your treasury, which then to Europeans meant you increased your power. Well, that was kind of the nutshell of the 1400s, the 1500s, the 1600s, the 1700s, all brought about courtesy of the age of discovery. Well, by the mid-19th century, this new phenomena that we talked about in Chapter 1, the Industrial Revolution, comes along. And in the Industrial Revolution, Europeans need several things. They need raw materials. They need natural resources. They need markets to sell the things that they are mass producing, because in the Industrial Revolution, you can make more. And because you make more, or can make more, you do. And because you do, you need to sell it. And you need to sell it because you got to keep the assembly lines humming, because you have all these workers that have now flocked into big areas called cities, that we've got to keep them employed and fed, because governments do not want large masses of people unemployed and starving. That is bad for government, bad for stability and order of that country, of that nation. And so Europeans, in trying to find markets to sell all of their stuff, to find raw materials and resources in order to keep the men and women employed, in order to keep the factories humming, in order to keep the economies moving along, they branched out and began to practice a type of philosophy or ideology called imperialism. Imperialism is directly a cause of the Industrial Revolution, or pardon me, it is caused by the Industrial Revolution. It is also a manner in which one country imposes on another its will, either economically, either militarily, politically, socially, culturally, one way or the other. We see examples of this all around. In Japan, seeing the Coca-Cola sign, in other faraway lands, seeing McDonald's or Subways or Levi's. where culture has taken over. American music, rock and roll music, has taken over certain cultures. That's just one example of the fruit of imperialism. Europeans, England, France, Germany, Russia to a much less degree, the Dutch, Spain to a lesser degree by the 1800s, began to expand into Asia and into Africa for the reasons I have mentioned. They do it through a couple of ways. They do it through the power of their military, obviously, the power of their navies, the power of their armies. They do it through the power of their governments. And they rule those countries, those areas, through one of two ways: direct rule, where they just come in and take over and their people run the country, or they do it through a thing called indirect rule. And indirect rule is where I go into the country, but I bring people who look like that country up through the ranks and make them loyal to me, but they become the leaders of those countries, of those areas, of those lands. That's kind of a nutshell of what imperialism is. So far, we could argue good or bad, one way or the other. When we talk again in a day or two, I'd like to talk to you about a few things that are the kind of the uglier side of imperialism. The consequences of imperialism, the justifications that Europeans will employ to explain why it's perfectly okay for them to go into these lands and take them over. The justifications and the explanations they will use in describing the people that they are conquering. Because what's really interesting at this particular time, as Europeans are going into Africa and Asia, is that at about the same time in Europe, there is this very interesting study going on about, we call it eugenics, about what causes or how and in what ways are there racial differences. And what do those racial differences mean? These things are coinciding one with another. Imperialism and the study of eugenics. And one other thing that we're going to throw into this stew of imperialism, one other ingredient, is about this time Charles Darwin talks about the origins of species. And English philosophers come along and they say, just as humans, or all living forms, are born, mature, grow old, decay, and die, institutions created by man are born, mature, grow old, decay, and die. It's a philosophy called social Darwinism. And the mantra of social Darwinism is survival of the fittest. We've got a lot to talk about when I see you in a couple of days, and we finish Chapter 2 on imperialism. And it won't be much to see how we get from these ideas of imperialism and eugenics and social Darwinism, and I promise you it will lead in a straight line to the gas chambers of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Auschwitz, and Hitler's mad science. Well, enough for now on that cheery note. We'll talk in a couple of days. Bye.